things that was very, very fast impacted was the smallholder farmers markets, the street markets. Most of the smallholder farmers in the country, they were not able to take their food to the market. But which also means those who depend on this market for their food supply, they could not access the food.
Bon, l'année passée, moi j'ai exporté parce que j'ai vendu ici le kilo à 200 francs, la mangue là, le kilo à 200. Et vraiment, j'avais à peu près vendu 17 casios. Mais cette maladie nous a vraiment fait qu'on a le prix abaissé. Finki buraka bolo la bu jowti jat ko sumuta ko ni ko vik bunu jukale bu gala bola. Par rapport au manque et aux produits maraîchers, c'était des problèmes. Mais après, on va voir derrière, vous allez voir, vraiment, il y a beaucoup de pourriture. On a jeté.
And it's not to say that there was no food. That's the irony. There was food, it was rotting in the farms, and people were going hungry because they could not access it.
COVID exposed how complex global supply chains, directed by the global north, can easily be disrupted and prevent Africans from eating the food which they grow, even when it can't be exported.
Parce qu'avec ce Covid-19 et la fermeture des frontières, cela nous a éveillé nos consciences. Nous avons, emprunté nos ventres à l'extérieur. Tout ce qui nous permet de vivre nous vient de l'extérieur. Et maintenant, si ces frontières-là ou ces sources-là sont coupées, qu'est-ce que nous allons devenir?
Africa could grow all of its food, but 60% of the world's unused farmable land is here. Meanwhile, the continent imports more food than it exports, with some countries buying in an astonishing 80%. After Europe's colonial control over most of Africa ended in the 1960s, the global north took measures to exert its dominance over trade with Africa. Europe and the US restricted the ability of African farmers to compete in their huge markets, using mechanisms such as free trade agreements, which force African countries to lift customs charges on imported food.
Every time you hear a free trade agreement, it should raise some red flags. It's a very colonial construct, taking into consideration the history of extraction from the West, and this exacerbates that extraction. It comes from our colonial history as well, where cash crops were really put at the fore of what our agricultural production should be about.
Once the colonial powers carved up Africa for themselves, the continent's role became to supply the global north's industry with the goods it needed to flourish. Commodities like copper and rubber, and a few cash crops like cocoa and coffee. Africa's resources and labor became so geared towards satisfying Europe's needs that the colonies had to import to have enough food to feed their people. This created a situation where, in times of crisis, the price of these imports soar, while money coming from exports drops, trapping Africa further into debt and dependency on loans from the IMF and World Bank.
You have to borrow. That's why the bottom line, you have to borrow. The reasons why you have to borrow is one, you don't have the money. The disadvantage of importing anything and everything willy-nilly has meant that we left ourselves open to dumping goods that are substandard and also suppressing local capacity to produce.
Another relic from the colonial era, to suppress local food production, continues today through structural adjustment programs, imposed on African countries by the IMF and World Bank. The offer from the financial institutions was simple. We'll pay off your debt inherited from the colonial period if you make certain adjustments to your economy. The adjustments were classically neoliberal. As well as opening up access to African markets for American and European food producers, they forced African governments to eliminate subsidies for their own farmers. Many farmers have gone out of business as a result of these policies, after imports became cheaper than the food they produce. the prosperity promised by the IMF and the World Bank's development clearly hasn't come to fruition in places like Kaduna. In fact, the level of free trade and subsidy bans imposed on Africa aren't even allowed in the US and Europe. Industrial farms in the United States get $20 billion a year of government subsidies, a crucial factor in enabling them to undercut African farmers.
If you think about the US economy versus the Kenyan economy, I don't know how equal or fair a negotiation between such different economies would be. The US has subsidies for their farmers. It will just open up for a mass importation of food. And again, the same problems will be exacerbated to 10 times. It almost feels like it's inequality by design. It isn't a haphazard culmination of events that has us so food insecure. To keep populations in the West fed and healthy.
While Africa struggles to feed itself with imports, much of its own food is produced by women smallholder farmers. Just like in the colonial era, these producers are dependent on farming a small range of cash crops that the global north desires. Lately, this has taken the shape of the so-called Green Revolution, a plan sponsored by billionaire philanthropists like Bill Gates, the United Nations, and of course, the World Bank and IMF.
On the agriculture side, how do we bring the international financial institutions like the World Bank, the Africa Development Bank, the IMF, and bring the technology and innovation that they need so that they produce those yields? Because ultimately, it's not just Africa that needs to be fed, the world needs to be fed.
The plan entails turning smallholder farms like these in Senegal into intensive industrial farms using the seeds and fertilizers of Western agribusiness. One such initiative is Nerica, a commercial rice-growing program.
ñu jox ma semence Nerica, ñu jox ma engrais, ma ciy béy première année ceeb mu xaw a baax engrais produit waa ANCAR topp ma. La deuxième fois ñu ne damay jënd engrais bi ak semence bi parce que semence bu ma denc bu Nerica bi dafay yàqu lu tuuti ma jënd 3 kilos ma nar a béy fii nii yëpp xale yi ñëw pour béy ñu ne mère sa faro bi dëgër na neexu la béy ak kajandu ma fay xale yi pour 0.
Recent studies of the Green Revolution found that over 12 years, yields of crops have not seen significant increases. And the number of undernourished people has increased 30% in the countries that took part. So, the Green Revolution has extracted money from Africa, made its farmers dependent on multinationals for seeds, but not led to any real development, showing all the hallmarks of a truly neocolonial project.
Donc l'Alliance pour une révolution verte, c'est un programme qui est mis en place par Rockefeller et Melinda et Bill Gates. Quand ils vont partout, c'est avec leurs ressources financières qu'ils prennent les gouvernants en otage. Donc c'est là où est né le mouvement Nous sommes la solution, mais qui est piloté actuellement par des organisations de femmes rurales. Nous avons des experts qui sont là et qui peuvent travailler pour la promotion de la pratique agroécologique. Des savoirs et des connaissances traditionnelles qui sont connus depuis des générations. On pense qu'on peut aussi trouver une solution, trouver une stratégie, anéantir ou à diminuer les effets de ces firmes. Parce que cette révolution verte est venue pour enrichir les firmes industrielles et non les paysans et non les Africains.
This kind of resistance is appearing across Africa, with the IMF and their counterparts at the top of the hit list. Nigeria and Senegal, along with 13 other West African nations, recently demanded an outright cancellation of their debt. and Kenya has rejected a COVID loan due to the exploitative terms. Public consciousness of IMF exploitation is also growing, with musicians like Sean Kuti in Nigeria educating people through his songs.
To my people. I wrote that song, International Motherfuckers. You know, because I just wrote it because I wanted to directly draw a link between how African rulers are controlled by Western aid money. All we need to see is the billions of dollars that are flowing to Africa in the name of aid every year that do not translate to any kind of development for the African people.
One country that realized early on that development loans were not translating to development was Zimbabwe.
Zimbabwe is almost like that country that is pioneering the journey of African sovereignty. What Africa is eating is supposed to be defined by Africans.
Under the late President Mugabe, Zimbabwe refused to pay back their debt. And in 2000, fought back against IMF privatizations by bringing their land into public ownership. Farmers like Nelson were given land once occupied by white settlers under the Land Reform Program, which provoked economic sanctions from Europe and the US that continue to this day.
When we took our land back and redistributed it to the ordinary people, the focus by our detractors was to hit us where it matters most. Anything that was related to agriculture, that were put under sanctions. And then any product from a farm that was once owned by a white farmer would not be accepted anywhere else on the market, in the international market. Every farmer that you know outside this country is supported by the government and the financial institutions. Zimbabwe cannot do that. Once all the other farmers in the world can do that. Why? Because of these sanctions. This is how sanctions affect our agriculture.
Decades of sanctions has had a crippling effect on Zimbabwe's economy, making it especially vulnerable when Cyclone Idai hit last year, destroying vast tracts of farmland, homes, and further worsening food insecurity. The UN's World Food Programme has been helping those suffering the impact of the cyclone.
Ndichipandakadzoka kuti ndakudzoka kurara ndakanga ndakutura machira pamubhedha saka ndakabvisa machira ndichimadzorera wardrobe ndiri kudzorera wardrobe bva ndaisoisa musoro side uku pamubhedha.
Susan's farmhouse is still in ruins, more than a year after the cyclone. Evidence that the distribution of aid to this area hasn't been entirely unconditional. Global North sanctions prevent aid from reaching former white farms like Susan's, while farmers in neighbouring countries affected by the cyclone have been helped.
Irima sezvamaonawo kuti munda wedu wanga wakakura zvakanyanya. Tairima tichikohwa.
I just feel that any form of sanctions that undermines food security is detrimental to people. It is extremely important that food security, which is a basic human right, should not be jeopardized.
But while the UN condemns the impact of sanctions, it is an influential backer of the Global North's one-sided pro-capital policies in Africa, which exacerbate the impact of climate disasters, conflict, and have deepened the continent's dependence on Western trade and aid. This dependence puts food security at risk as soon as a crisis, like Corona, hits.
You find that many of the influencers in society are fostering the culture of dependency, doing this so-called giveaway and this charity. Charity is the safe place of the world's oppressors. They can use 23 hours of their day to destroy the world and give us 1 hour as some kind of token. One thing many Africans don't understand is that we actually have gotten it right in Africa many times. When they talk about the history, Lumumba, Sankara, all these great men, the sabotage of Nkrumah's Ghana, we've seen them all.
Notre pays produit suffisamment de quoi nous nourrir. Nous pouvons dépasser même notre production, malheureusement. Par manque d'organisation, nous sommes encore obligés de tendre la main pour demander des aides alimentaires. Ces aides alimentaires qui nous bloquent, qui nous inspirent, qui installent dans nos esprits cette habitude, ces réflexes de mendiant, d'assister.
I feel in Kibera there's a huge over-reliance on donor aid and funding and NGOs, because even 90% of the NGOs in Kibera, some of their foundations are in the US, the UK. It's not like started down here. So Janet, we've brought you these things from Kibera Food Drive. We have sugar, we have rice.
In Kibera, Africa's largest slum of well over 500,000 people, its residents have started to help themselves where the NGOs have been absent.
Currently, NGOs are working from home, and us, we are working at home. We cannot be behind our laptop to serve our people. We have to be physically, visit those houses amidst COVID and all the fears and all the anxiety and everything about it.
We realized that no one is going to help us, so it was Africans themselves, starting their own initiatives, going to the ground, giving food and fundraising for themselves.
I am an Afro-optimist because of the wealth we have in this continent. We have the fertile land. We have food that are not made from the laboratory. They come from the soil. You find it here in Africa.
But we also have to remember that food is not just for consumption. It's a whole cultural undertaking to prepare and eat food. We are losing the culture that is attached to the food. And when it comes now to the question of food sovereignty, what it means is the people decide how they use their land, what they produce, what they eat, how they produce.
Et aujourd'hui, moi, je dis bien que pour qu'il y ait une nouvelle Afrique, une décolonisation, il faut que ce soit l'engagement des jeunes et des femmes, et qui ont toujours soutenu la souveraineté alimentaire en Afrique. Ceeb reen yi du dem ci biir ci kaw lay nekk superficiel. Suñu maam yi dañ doon sóoraale li nga xam ne ni mooy sonnal ceeb mooy acidité ak salinité. Donc loolu day tax plante bi nga xam ne ni mu ngi ci kaw ci biome bi nekkul ci plat day mën a développer wu correctement lu am solo la. Ci li nga xam ne ni technique agroécologie la. Nous souhaitons que ça soit une agroécologie paysanne qui favorise les connaissances et les pratiques. On ne veut pas rester dans l'antiquité. Mais on peut améliorer sans nuire ce que nous avons autour de nous. Les colons étaient venus, ils disaient que notre agriculture n'était pas la meilleure. Ils n'ont pas pu résoudre leurs objectifs. Jusqu'à présent, ils sont obligés de revenir sur ce que faisaient nos ancêtres.